second day's session, 9 o'clock. And that's going to be President Development 3, the China's Proposed Economic and Security Pact and Pacific Response. We all have seen ambivalent roles of China these days because China has been quite active player in the Pacific region. Maybe last 20 years, maybe last 5 years is quite more increasing. And we had a sort of, what we call it, controversial concept in the Pacific, free and open in the Pacific concept. That was actually proposed by Japan 2018 or something. So this controversial concept was sort of it's becoming very important, but at the same time create some sort of arguments that good or bad for many countries involved in this area. So we're going to have 4 distinguished speakers for this panel to discuss that, and we're going to begin with Dr. Henry Rachel. Thank you. You are too.
Yes.
Sorry. So you have 8 minutes.
18 minutes.
8.
Oh, 8 minutes. Sorry.
I'm sorry, not the 80.
Yeah. Anyway, friends, colleagues, and one talk. We like to talk thank you, Higo. Pastor and Long Papa Bilong ground, where you may sit down on this black panel. Papa like Bilong ground and more Nanawal, Nambi people. Me like acknowledging Papa Bilong ground, who's had to go past. Papa Bilong ground, who's had to start now, long this black time. Now Papa Bilong ground, who's had to come behind. For those of you who don't understand talk pissing, I've acknowledged the custodians of this land, the Nanawal and the Nambi people, past, present, and future on this ground. We stand to speak on this panel. The topics and questions we have been asked to deliberate on are sensitive and difficult ones. The first question that has been proposed for us, especially for me as a Melanesian, concerns our one-block state, the Solomon Islands and its security agreement with China. As one talks, we generally refrain from commenting on our Melanesian one-block states, business and internal and sovereign affairs. We respect the notion of non-interference on other states' internal and sovereign matters. However, in saying that, the topic has implications for regional stability. Therefore, from the outset, I'd like to ask for understanding from my Melanesian one-talks. If I say things that offend you, also I may like talk, sorry, Pastor, I reservedly apologize up front. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and my colleagues to talk. And basically, I've tried to answer all the questions. I ended up writing a very long paper, and I'll try and summarize it in a short form. So the first question that's been posed to us is the implications of Solomon Islands China Security Agreement for security cooperation in Solomon Islands. The first qualification I want to make here is that we are speculating on contents of a draft agreement being the same as the one signed in April 2022. I haven't seen the draft agreement, and I haven't seen the final document. I don't think it's out there. It's still a secret. But that is the prerogative of the Solomon Islands to disclose the contents of the agreement, and let's respect that decision. But the agreement, I know, will find its way to the public domain. And I think it may be driven by a political agenda and possibly against the current government. So I anticipate the next elections to be quite an important one. So that's the first qualification I want to make. But one implication I see is that keeping agreements secret is a poor way of governing society. Secret agreements, in my view, are a sad way of governing people and state affairs. It defeats openness, transparency, and accountability. It creates suspicion and distrust in government. Why should security agreements and bilateral relations with certain foreign governments dictate the way we conduct government? Now, there's also this trend around bilateral and multilateral security agreements. And I think bilateral security agreements are a shift away from multilateral regional agreements like Ramsey under the Bikatawa Declaration. And I suppose this current agreement that Solomon Islands and China have is unfinished business from Ramsey, particularly around the area of capacity building for law enforcement. We have the same challenges in Papua New Guinea around law enforcement, and I'll touch a bit on the what was then called the Enhanced Cooperation Program that PNG signed with Australia, and which was discontinued because certain provisions of that agreement were found to be unconstitutional. But concepts like sovereignty and non-interference are qualified concepts. And Ramsey, Australia, Solomon Islands, China, security agreements show the qualification of issues around sovereignty and non-interference. I already talked a bit about the special privileges of like immunity from prosecution, which is also in the draft agreement with China. It's also in the agreement that Australia signed with Solomon Islands. And that is going to be Papua New Guinea at the moment is considering a security agreement with Australia. And that's the point that I've raised with them, is to have a look at history and let history point as your compass going forward and looking at these issues, because some of these agreements have noble intentions, and we have to make sure that our country's sovereignty is not compromised. Now, of course, the China and Solomon Islands pact has local politics intersecting with geopolitics, and I think you're all aware of this. So I'll just lay it on the table, but it has definitely heightened geopolitical interest and strategic competition in this part of the region. And I think the particular provision that triggered this is the onshore facility that is provided for in the agreement. My colleague Ala knows it a bit also. She can share with us when she talks. As it appears, all the islands from Darwin in Western Province, Papua New Guinea, all the way to Franklin Islands in Kiribati, all those islands with deep water ports are suspect to be bases, potential military bases for China's interest in this region. And there appears to be a huge level of distrust, particularly of Pacific Island leaders, that their words can be taken when they say no such base will be built. There is no belief in their word. And I remember a 60-minute program where the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea was pointedly asked by a journalist to deny whether Papua New Guinea will allow China to build military bases in his country. He was even asked whether he knew anything about the China agreement, and he said he doesn't know anything about it. It's not his business to comment on his neighbor's politics. Anyway, but they didn't believe it. But you can understand the geopolitical concerns that Australia, the US have around these offshore facilities. When I say that, you look at the examples China's claim to coral reefs in the South China Sea where military bases have been constructed, and in territorial waters belonging to the Philippines and Vietnam. And Japan's experience of building military bases in the Pacific before World War II, and the acquisition of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, and a PLA base in Djibouti in 2017. So those kind of examples point to these concerns that Western allies have about the moves in here. But notably, as I said earlier, the Pacific Islands off the coast of Australia are suspected to be potential military bases, and that ranges from Luganville in 2015, Tulagi 2019, after the Solomon Islands switched from Taiwan to China, the Canton Islands in Kiribati, more recently Kolombangara, and a proposed China-funded development in Daru 2019, sale of a privately owned island known as the Conflict Islands in Milne Bay in 2022, and I can't rule out Bougainville, which could potentially become a new state, and we can expect political interest in a part of my country, PNG. Now, we have also really seen active and increased interest in geopolitics in the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific Islands are really at the center of big power attention, yeah? And it went to the point of a virtual address on the 12th of July, 2022 by Vice President Kamala Harris, and then a meeting in Washington with US President Biden on the 29th of September. And the US is making a big return to the region, and Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, you know, has been crisscrossing the Pacific, the Blue Pacific continent. It's actually really great to see, in my view, more cooperation. And I mean, the recent meeting by Anthony Albanese, Australia's Prime Minister, and US President Biden with Xi Jinping in the G20 meeting in Bali, I think is a really good indication of working on cooperation rather than on competition. Now, the second question we have been asked to discuss is what issues arise from China's efforts to secure regional security and economic pact. And the question I pose is, does the Pacific have the capacity to collectively manage the sudden burst of interest in this region? China's comprehensive security treaty is a display of regional leadership by the Pacific to look at it and make a polite decision to decline it. US, its more recent strategy might have passed in terms of consultations, but the Pacific now show the side of the fence. They sit and they must manage their relations with China. And China will remain an active player in the region for a number of reasons. It was here in the past, it will be here at the present, and it will be there in the future. So everybody has to learn to work with China in their needs. What do the responses of Pacific Island countries to China's overtures tell us about the future of regional security cooperation? Well, region ought to be consulted and informed on major regional initiatives, ideally through the Pacific Islands Forum. Pacific leaders, unfortunately, cannot insulate themselves from the security dynamics projected by geopolitics and strategic competition. And I think part of that is like the absence of a institutionalized regional mechanism, and which exposes specific leaders' ability to collectively manage and navigate the geopolitical security risks that are here present. Yesterday, Professor Ratua was talking about the Tower Declaration. When leaders were framing, they didn't think about the impact of pandemics. And so I think existing frameworks like that need, and in support of what Stephen was saying yesterday, it needs to have a look at its scope and have the flexibility to cater for the evolving geopolitical climate. I think the important thing that they need to recognize is how to manage non-interference, and they need to review the meaning of crisis. Crisis is what triggers a Pacific Island state under the Tower Declaration to invite the forum to have a look at the issue and decide whether there will be a regional intervention or not. So I think that's what they should be working on. Solomon Islands had an approach called Top Story, which they did at the forum. But I think Top Story is really after effect explanation. I think a more proactive approach would be like something like what we call in Top Listen, Top Survey. That is, you inform your Pacific families first before anything that might invoke regional instability. And so such mechanisms, a Top Survey approach is really, in Melanesian culture, if I'm going to go to the bush, I have to tell my neighbors where I am going. Because something happens to me in the bush, they don't want to find me. So this is really an approach where we let our family members know that we are going into this arrangement. If it has implications, let us know so we can navigate it collectively. Yeah. Now, what are the implications of geopolitical discussions about China at a local level? Well, geopolitics in its contemporary state and its implications at a local level should not be isolated to China. The US, Australia, France, India, Japan, New Zealand, including China, are all engaged in geopolitics and strategic competition in the region. So we shouldn't isolate it to China alone. We're all in the game. The Pacific leaders are trying to manage their existence in this region where geopolitics and geostrategic competition has intensified and become more complex. China is seen as a development partner, like Australia, US, and others. Political and diplomatic neutrality is preferable as opposed to being sandwiched in a power competition by major powers. Military buildup and the language of war is the least of Pacific Islands' interest. Security issues for Pacific Islands are more developmental, non-traditional security threats, whereas major powers are worried about geostrategic competition. And at the local level, really, it's all about bread and butter issues. So that's what I've come to share. Thank you very much. I'll give it to my colleagues to add happy to fill some questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Henry, for really setting the scene for us here today. Before I start, I'd just like to express my respect for the traditional custodians of this land, but also to thank the organisers of this activity and Hide for chairing this discussion today, but also to thank the audience because there is an amazing mix of people from within the Pacific and also a few from outside it. I've had the great privilege to meet you over the last day or so. So I'll try and just skip through with a response to each question because as Henry's noted, we have 4. So firstly, in relation to the Solomon Islands China Security Agreement from April this year, I'd summarise that as the Solomon Islands taking a step past what has become quite a tradition of strategic hedging amongst the Pacific Island countries which suits their national interests. But in the case of Solomon Islands, this would be more what gets described in international relations as a limited alignment, which is an interesting decision. And there's questions, I guess, some people have raised from within the Solomons. Is this in their national interest? Obviously, the leader who made the decision and his government believes that it is. And then there's opinions from outside the Solomon Islands, from other Pacific countries as well. But so that's the start point. A second point that I'd raise that has come from a fairly senior academic within the Solomons is a belief that this decision could split the Royal Solomon Islands Police Force, because there is a deep division over whether this was a good or a bad idea, and that is not a good thing, as that is the most important element of maintaining stability in the Solomon Islands, and that needs to be considered as well. And I'll just add some points from my own research and my own specialisation, just to note that China, it was probably questioned 8 years ago, but in that space, a lot of things have changed. And as China has risen, it has become clear that the PRC is actively looking for access in the Pacific. And I say that rather than bases, as most of us know them. I think this agreement was symbolic of that intent. It has been clearly expressed by the Chinese government 10 years ago. The Chinese Communist Party directed all of its different mechanisms to actively look for establishing bases in both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And I think along the way there was an internal debate, particularly in the military in China, where the term dual-use facility was first proposed by Rear Admiral Yin Zhou in 2010. And he was raising the point that in places like the Pacific, clearly it is not going to be in the national interest of one of those countries to have a base per se. Nevertheless, there was an intent from a Chinese perspective to be able to project power and to have greater reach as their power grew. And so they were looking for a way that they could achieve that, noting that basing as we know it would not be accepted, and thus the term dual-use facilities was hatched. Happy to discuss more about that later. The final point on this first one is that security statecraft, as I describe it, has clearly increased in the Pacific Islands, particularly within the Melanesian states, from a Chinese perspective, within the last 5 years. And that has included, just in the last 18 months, the bringing in of Chinese defence attachés to Papua New Guinea, to Fiji, and to Tonga, which is something the People's Liberation Army had promised they would do for 15 years before that. The question would be why, after kind of putting it on the back burner, why suddenly now? And I think that a follow-on from those defence attachés is then we've seen a lot of police involvement. That's included a police liaison officer in Suva, but then, as everyone knows, more recently, not just a police liaison officer, but a police liaison team in Solomon Islands as part of this agreement that we're talking about. Moving on to the second point, the Regional Economic and Security Pact, as it's described here. So what we're talking about is what was proposed as a common development vision that was proposed by China to its 10 Pacific partners that recognised Beijing back in April, and that was in preparation for the second China-Pacific Island countries foreign ministers meeting, which was going to happen at the end of May. And this led to a number of different reactions. That document itself, which was a draft, and which, as Henry has pointed out, was not accepted by those 10 Pacific countries, but this draft document did specifically mention the integration of political, economic and security cooperation between China and those 10 countries. And that has specific implications if that is indeed China's intent ongoing, even though it was at the time rejected by the Pacific Islands that were being engaged by China. I note that very recently, as in just before this conference, the first ministerial dialogue on police capacity building and cooperation was held, and that was one of the proposals from that development vision and the 5-year action plan back in April. So just to note, in particular, the reaction of President of the Federated States of Micronesia, David Panuelo, at the time when he received the letter, he wrote one out to go to all the Pacific Islands and to all the partners. So he expanded the aperture from 10 countries to 22 and created a discussion. He was quite critical of the proposal, and one quote that I have from that is he described it as a smokescreen for a larger agenda, and he predicted that it would bring a new Cold War era at best and a world war at worst, which is pretty stark analysis from Panuelo. The other point about that particular proposal was it sought to align the Belt and Road Initiative with the Pacific's 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, which Panuelo took issue with. At the same time, Samoa's Prime Minister Fiame was disconcerted just principally by the lack of time to consult and the lack of ability to discuss amongst the Pacific Islands. But at the time, those 10 nations said, at least not now, and did not accept that draft, and another product came out of the meeting. I guess from my perspective, I believe there is a risk that Panuelo raised of division of the Pacific, in that this was an attempt at forcing a consensus on security, among other matters, with a subset of the Pacific rather than with all of the Pacific Islands. And I think that was probably the greatest issue about what was, I guess you would call a grand strategic document, because it was looking to integrate economic, political and security matters. I don't think the intent behind that document is going to go away. I think China's expressed its intent, and as I said, the ministerial meeting on police the other day is an expression of that continued intent. I'll move on to the third question, which is about the future of regional security cooperation. I believe it's developed a lot in the last decade, and I think a lot of that has been for good reasons that haven't necessarily had anything to do with geopolitics. In the end, it has played into geopolitics. But to start with, the needs to do with humanitarian assistance and to do with fisheries were the main motivators. And I think what we need to do, and probably from a Pacific perspective, the important thing to do is to maintain that focus on those needs and a focus on the national interests of the countries involved, to make sure that despite the geopolitical pressures that might be influencing the region and definitely pushing everybody around, that the countries involved, regardless of their size and scale, manage to still pursue their own interests. I think that's really important. Also noted that in yesterday's discussion, Miranda Booth proposed a Pacific Island Forum Secretariat HADR Coordination Centre, and I thought that was an excellent idea in terms of trying to maintain that regional agency. And it does help to get away around some of the problems, including some things mentioned by J5 from the Joint Operations Command yesterday. When there is a disagreement, say between some Western militaries and the Chinese military not wanting to operate together, having such a facility in such a command and control structure that was owned by the Pacific Islands could enable better integration and cooperation. But that's enough on that from me. The final point I'll just make quickly on local level issues to do with China's involvement in Pacific Islands is just that there is some real complexities everywhere that are different to everywhere else, that are generally not understood by outsiders. And this is something I've done a lot of research on in the last 8 years. It applies to every country that comes from outside the Pacific, with people trying to live or operate inside the Pacific. But it is a particular risk for Chinese, I've found, and particularly a risk for Chinese small businesses. And it's an issue when local agency feels the need to protect grassroots interests because of a need to protect their microeconomy. And it's something entirely different normally to the other geopolitical issues that we've just been discussing. And yet it gets conflated, and that can cause problems in itself. But I've talked for long enough, so thank you, Hide, and I'll hand over to Joe.
Hello, Joe. Can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay, great. So next round, please. Thank you.
All right, so I'd like to thank the organizers of the workshop for inviting me to join via Zoom. I'd just like to begin by saying that, the Solomon's politics is fundamentally shaped by PRC's direct diplomatic presence in the country since 2019, or September 2019. And it's obvious that PRC is deliberately expanding its reach across the Pacific and seeking to attain influence, through things such as the construction of stadiums, providing of funds, and in the case of the Solomons, the funds provided by PRC are not appropriated, and as well as soft power diplomacy as well, over what has long been a region. Other global powers, including Australia, and a classic example of such a soft power diplomacy that emerged following the Solomon Islands China security agreement that was leaked, which I don't, or I haven't seen the final document. What I have is just a leaked document. So what emerged following the agreement, and also published in the local print media, was Chinese police officers training local police, as well as youths and women as well, martial arts and kung fu. And this is an interesting way of gaining influence, then establishing a military base. And why I'm saying this is because many people in the Solomons, and I'm sure elsewhere, one talks elsewhere in another nation elsewhere, they know Bruce Lee more than the geopolitics discussion about China at the regional and local level. The Solomons China agreement is interesting because its framing, in fact, also resonates with the facilitation of the International Assistance Pact that provided the framework for Ramsey's work in the Solomons, for almost a decade. And I'll just give you an example. Under Article 1 of the agreement between China and the Solomons, it sort of provides the scope, the general scope, which highlights that upon the request by the Solomons government, China would assist in maintaining, social order, protecting people's lives, property, as well as providing humanitarian assistance and carrying out disaster response. And this is sort of, if you look at the Facilitation Act, that's sort of a similar wording as well in terms of the purpose of the intervention Ramsey. The only difference under the China's security agreement framing is that it adds in a sentence that saying China may also, according to its own needs, with the consent of the Solomons government, make ships to visit, in the country, as well as including other kinds of activities such as transit as well. And I guess this is where it sort of generates a discussion around military base in the Solomons. But the content, it's only about, the draft is only about 6 pages, and while looking at the content, it's not very clear whether the agreement is a treaty or whether it's an executive agreement. And then this is important because it also leads into discussion around whether the agreement is self-executing or whether it's non-executing, because that would determine whether there's a need for an implementing domestic legal framework like the Facilitation Act, to make provision or to make the agreement's provision enforceable in the Solomons. But Henry has sort of pointed some of the key things in the agreement, like immunity, for instance. That would sort of require discussions around whether there should be a domestic legal framework to capture some of the provisions. Now there are some interesting interesting elements that sort of emerge following the agreement, the security agreement. So one of the elements is sort of the element of repression, press crackdown, and sort of surveillance state techniques. And there's this in the news. There's sort of discussion around the government sort of looking at SIBC and trying to have conversations around how they publish the news. There's also elements of autocracy as well, and dissolution of freedoms. A classic example of this element is the suspension of the constitution and the delaying of the national elections to 2024. And then a third element is sort of this, debate around the move towards a one-party state, or I've seen in news articles debate around proxy or puppet state clientelism, and that also has elements in the Solomons, and an area that can be seen is in terms of the budget. There's debate that it seems to be favoring members that are part of the ruling government. Yes, so those are just some of my general comments in response to our questions.
Thank you.
And
Kia ora tātou everyone. It's great to see everyone back today. And now I'm just conscious of time, and we really, there's a lot to talk about in this session, and we really want to hear from everybody in the room. And given the fact that my colleagues here in Canberra and in Hawaii have effectively covered everything that we need to know about these issues, I'm just going to touch on some key points that stand out for me with respect to firstly the security agreement, of which we've seen a draft version but not the final version, obviously, as Henry's pointed out, and then the Common Development Vision plan, which Foreign Minister Wang Yi thought to have adopted during his visit, and then some of the implications. So firstly, the Solomons-China Security Agreement and the earlier policing MOU and agreement, which was signed in March also, reflect two dynamics which are of particular interest to me. One of which is that it signals China's intention with respect to putting meat on the bones of its claim that it is a security stakeholder in the Pacific. And it used that particular phrase back in 2021 to describe itself for the first time, actually. And that was quite significant because of the type of language that China had used previously to describe its role in the Pacific. And so what did it mean by that? And what we've seen play out, particularly in the Solomons with respect to the policing arrangements and the subsequent deal in March, April, is an attempt to really flesh out this idea of China as a security stakeholder. And part of that is the fact that in Solomons, and a lot of our focus is obviously on the Solomons this morning, but we can talk more broadly as well, is on expanding its policing footprint in Solomons, expanding out into the provinces as well, the training of around 180 police and correctional staff, and a number of other initiatives as well, including the donation of kit, water cannons, riot gear, and of course the rather infamous replica weapons. So part of that, and the security stakeholder language as well is also reflected in the Common Development Vision and accompanying action plan too, which, as we know, wasn't adopted. The second element of this is that security cooperation in Solomon Islands has very clearly become a site for strategic competition, and we also see this to a far lesser degree more broadly across the region as well, but it's really crystallized in Solomon Islands, and that has a whole host of implications, not least, as Pete mentioned, tensions within the RSIPF with respect to the decision to switch to China, but also with respect to now having two competing security stakeholders, Australia and China, training and, in one case, arming units within the RSIPF. And for everyone here who knows Solomon Islands history, that is deeply concerning. Recent history particularly. So Australia is obviously seeking to maintain its role as a security partner of choice, but I think it's also worthwhile just reflecting on some of the comments that have been made as a consequence of the security agreement, and one of which is by Chinese communities in Solomon Islands who have responded to it. So the Solomon Islands Chinese Association recently made the comment that now Chinese in Solomon Islands have a greater sense of security as a consequence of Chinese police being on the ground, and we have seen photographs of Chinese police patrolling in Honiara as well. And the Solomon Islands Chinese Association has said that they've now set up a contact center between the Chinese police and Chinese residents. So that speaks to part of the concerns that were reflected by the Solomon Islands China security deal, which was around Chinese citizens and protecting Chinese citizens during instability. Now, with respect to the way in which Solomon politicians and officials have responded to this, Permanent Secretary Colin Beck from Foreign Affairs made the comment a couple of months back that invoking the Solomon Islands security deal was a measure of last resort. And he specifically cited the reasons for signing it, which were instability and vulnerability as a consequence of, as he said, 18,000 youth. And he drew a direct parallel between development and security, the development security nexus in the Solomon Islands. And also comments were made at that time as well that there was certainly no intention, despite media overseas, that a base was going to result. And this comes back to a point that a number of the panelists have made, is that around Chinese intentions in the Solomons and in the Pacific more broadly, and this idea of how you establish some type of persistent presence. And arguably, China has already done that through the policing mission and through this growing network of defense and police attaches across the Pacific. And that's where these concerns are around whether or not China is seeking to establish some form of alternative security network, or as we call loosely architecture, in the Pacific. It's also important to have a sense of where this is coming from on the Chinese side. And in early this year, the global Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Global Security Initiative, and the growing policing presence in Solomon Islands and activity and the security deal all actually reflect important elements of that. And the Global Security Initiative, which was proposed back in 2022 and is still fairly vague and it's not policy as such, does actually call for the promoting of a common security globally, and as some Chinese scholars have suggested, it's about sort of shaping global security governance in such a way that it's favourable to China's interests, and that includes obviously in the Pacific as well. And as I said, it's certainly more proposal than policy at this stage, but it does reflect China's interest in sort of expanding Beijing's brand of policing in the Pacific. Just turning really quickly to the Common Development Vision, and that's really sort of been covered off by my colleagues. But obviously it did reflect this growing sort of alignment around economic and security interests on the part of China. There was significant pushback, as has been acknowledged by Pacific leaders, hence it not being adopted. It did reflect, obviously, China's interest in moving from a bilateral approach to its relationships in the region to a multilateral, which is quite significant because of this sort of building of sort of hubs and spokes. And it's also important to note too that during Foreign Minister Wang's visit to the Pacific, he signed a host of bilateral MOUs and agreements across the region, many of which reflect elements of the Common Development Vision and the Action Plan, and also many of which were signed in quick succession. You know, it was quite large numbers, particularly in Kiribati, for example. It also reflected a response to possibly AUKUS and also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was announced shortly beforehand, and also reflected a degree of sort of diplomatic overreach by Beijing in the Pacific as well. And lastly, in terms of the implications of this uptick in geopolitical interest in the Pacific, the concerns, and I'll speak sort of at the national level because that's certainly where my sort of interview has been taking place, largely has been this really clear concern that the ability of Pacific states to manage strategic competition, regardless of whether or not it's China or the United States or Australia or New Zealand, is causing significant concern around the ability of Pacific states to be able to effectively hedge and balance these concerns, but to avoid being pushed towards making some form of strategic choice by their partners. And we have to be, countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States have to be incredibly careful to ensure that in the pursuit of strategic objectives in the region, that it doesn't actually destabilize and result in disruptive diplomacy and undermine the very objectives that Australia, New Zealand, and the US purport to be upholding in the region. I'm just going to end here, thank you, and then happy to take questions. Thank you.
We have been with great discussions on some islands, and we have seen so many controversial and perhaps security concerns are raised so dramatically last many years. So I'd like to throw this discussion to the floor, and so anybody wants, please.
Thank you, Sandra Todd from University of South Pacific. Morning everyone, and thank you panelists. I have a comment and a perhaps general question as well for everyone. On the point you made about countries not wanting to interfere or comment on others' decisions and actions, particularly on security matters, I just wanted to reflect on an incident in 2013 when Papua New Guinea and Australia agreed to set up the Manus asylum seekers what do you call it? Center at the time. And Fiji's Prime Minister Bainimarama actually called out that and said to Peter O'Neill, this is something that should have been discussed in the region because it has implications for the stability of our region. This was at a time when MSG was the focus of Fiji's regional diplomacy. And Peter O'Neill basically told him where to go. He said, this is not your business, don't interfere, this is a sovereign decision. And I think after that, the relationship between Peter O'Neill and Frank Bainimarama actually started to cool somewhat from what used to be a very warm relationship. But just on a general point, and a question actually for the panel, to do with China. And reading some of its statements, some of its partnership declarations and everything else, I see very little that seems to align with the Pacific Island countries' priorities, particularly when it comes, they never mention the Boy Declaration for a start. And climate change always seems to be very low down the list. And I just wonder, to what extent is that because obviously China doesn't recognize climate change as a security issue? And to what extent does the Pacific actually are they concerned about this fact that China does not particularly seem to engage in their own security discourse and narrative? Thank you.
I actually don't know if I have the answer to that question, but yes, I'm really a comment about the asylum facility in Papua New Guinea. I think there's a lot behind it that came to the decision, and that's between Australia and Papua New Guinea at that point in time. So I'll leave it as that. On your comment about the Boy Declaration and climate, I mean, what I see from the Pacific is, Pacific countries have issues with Australia around climate issues, and the relationship has been a struggle until more recently when the Labour government decided to take change of position on climate, and that has kind of warmed up the relationship with Pacific Islands. And Pacific Island leaders generally tend to be more critical of Australia, less critical of China. They push climate issues, but they're not, talking to China and saying, you're one of the biggest polluters, and you should be really looking at, the troubling costs into a climate that's really important to us. And I think it's partly because they have a comfortable relationship with Australia, and they can be able to say things. I think the relationship with China is one that I think is pretty sensitive and could potentially lead to disruptions in relations and things like that. So that's what my observation is. Basically, they're a little bit more reserved in their commentary on China than to say Australia and New Zealand they have a very long traditional relationship with, and I think they are able to say things that could be uncomfortable And I think there's just a general understanding in relation to Australia and the Pacific Island. So they feel probably more comfortable, making a point about issues around what concerns them. Whereas I think with China, they don't say it, that you're a big polluter and you should take action. I don't think I've heard Pacific Island be this.
Yeah, they have.
They
Absolutely on coal.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Yeah.
Hi, John.
John, you can go ahead. Thanks, Sandra, for your comment and also question. I think it's an important, really important question because, based on the draft that I've seen and some of the, documentation that are coming out, it seems that there's really no alignment in terms of the framing and how it aligns with the original documents that you just mentioned. And I agree with Henry, conversations around climate change seems absent when it comes to discussions with China. And I guess it's partly because of the nature of the relationship with China and Australia. The Pacific are more comfortable because of the sort of the historical nature of the relationship with Australia compared to China. And in the security agreement, it talks about consultation. How do you consult meaningfully when there seems to be an imbalance in terms of power?
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Pete, go ahead.
Thanks, Henry. I'm fascinated by those two answers. I don't have a whole lot to add, Sandra, but I guess from my perspective, I think the Pacific Islands have really clearly established climate as one of their highest, if not highest, collective priorities in the last decade, and that cannot be denied by anyone. And you see countries like Australia and China respond to that in different ways. And I think that's an important part of those relationships, regardless of whether it is discussed or not. And I guess these things continue to develop. And from an Australian perspective, the new government here has a different approach and I guess recognises that issue. I'm yet to really understand where that's going to take us.
I was actually comparing the US more than Australia in
Okay.
this context. The
Right.
US is much stronger in our focus.
Yes. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond really quickly. Thanks, Sandra. Firstly, when you refer to the concerns raised around Mamos, for example, and thinking about what took place when the security deal was signed this year and the informal diplomacy that was taking place amongst Pacific leaders and officials in response to the security deal. But that was completely overshadowed by Australia sending up its delegations and the US delegation as well. On the climate thing though, I was, Kirsty Kane has a publication on China and climate, as we know, on, so it might be, you might want to make a quick comment perhaps on this.
Sure. There's a prop here.
Thanks. My name's Tess Newton-Kane from the Griffith Asia Institute. I do have some copies of this thing which we published in August. Thank you, Anna, for referencing it. Which goes to this very point of how is this conversation proceeding between Pacific Island countries and China? What is the nature of that conversation? Where are the touch points and where are the divergence points? Dame Meg's already made reference to the fact that at a regional level and on a collective basis, leaders have called out China and made strong calls on China looking for more ambition we capture that in there. And we also spoke to people in 4 different Pacific Island countries around how these conversations go, and the title of it is Climate Conversations and Disconnected Discourses. So I'm not going to give away the punchline. I do have a few copies to give away if anybody wants them. It's not a long paper. Hopefully it's quite an easy read, but I think it does illustrate some of the complexities around this issue. And I think what's significant is, as Henry and Joe have referenced, is that it is an aspect of the firmament, if you like, that has largely not been given a lot of attention. So we see this very much as a conversation starter, and hopefully it will prompt some further work. Whilst I've got the microphone, Professor, is it okay if I ask my question?
Well,
Or did you have someone else lined up?
we have Alan.
All right.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Alan Tidwell, Georgetown University. Sandra, I just wanted to offer perhaps a reaction to your question. The United States was very aware of the misalignment between the PRC and Pacific Island leaders. And I will say that the NSC, who organized the presidential summit, the Pacific Summit, was very aware of needing to be seen, to be sensitive to and react to and listen to Pacific Island leaders. And I know at one point, for instance, that Niue and Cook Islands weren't included in the invitation list, but they made a point of changing course and acknowledging that where they were stumbling and being willing to be seen in public to stumble, but correct course. And I think that they have worked very hard to be responsive. And so I think that they're using that as a point of strategic differentiation. How's that?
Sorry, thank you. I'm Peter Fennell from the Asia Foundation. I think I've been lucky enough to be working in this space for more than 30 years, so I was going to make a few observations from that time, which hopefully may help the conversation. Firstly, my experience in the region is nationalism, national sovereignty will always override regionalism. So, that's a sort of base driver for decision making in any of these interactions with China and other geostrategic places such as Australia and New Zealand. The second point I'll make is clearly military is not policing and policing is not military, and everywhere I've seen it, from Afghanistan, every other place, it doesn't work particularly well. They're a different skill set, different mindset, and too often we put them in the same basket and say, look, that's how we do business. Third is, I'm all about protecting national sovereignty and also regional security. But a lot of that power and ability to do that rests with sovereign nations too. Like a lot of the do's made about the infrastructure investment in Daru, for instance. But if you went to Daru, you would realise that any sort of infrastructure investment would be highly welcome, particularly relating to its only industry. So by effectively, sort of having closer development partners, also national decisions, not making those investments, we create these vulnerabilities that we might sort of play up to be open back doors or whatever to other actors in this space. And the final observation I'll make is, I'll sort of make two more. Firstly, I was lucky enough when I was younger to be a police officer, and if any nation has a business community in a foreign country, and quite regularly that community is attacked and their business is burnt down, they'd be very keen to have a police presence and a police correction going forward. So that to me, I'm not saying there aren't secondary objectives, but that's quite clearly an objective from a policing point of view. And the last observation I'll make is, in development, all the good things about the future we learn from picking apart things we do poorly in the past. And we've just gone through a massive investment in Ramsey and also the policing assistance to the Solomon Islands, and clearly there's lessons about delivery partners' objectives and strategic objectives. And the one thing I've noticed that Australia could do a lot more defining what it strategically is trying to achieve by providing these law enforcement interventions and assistance, rather than just trying to come up with an agreed design and implement a design. It's sort of like more about doing things rather than achieving bigger picture things, and I think that's something that Australia and other actors actually have to work better with nations to come up with better planning that actually advances both interests, rather than just being a bit vague about it.
This lady is over there. Oh, yeah, that's a yeah.
Melissa Conley-Tyler from the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. I've really enjoyed all our discussions, but the takeaway I'm getting from this session is that the region's not seeing much alignment between China's approach and regional priorities. I spend a lot of time looking at Chinese foreign policy, and in that sense that doesn't surprise me. I mean, China's overarching foreign policy is about being a global power. So things like the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, there's bumper stickers where you fit in the various things you want. The Pacific, in the end, isn't one of China's highest priorities. If you look at its foreign policy objectives, the Pacific is a little peripheral. And that, of course, means it's a worry. If it's not treated seriously, if it doesn't really care about it, you don't expect it to be that good a partner. I really like, Anna, your point around, the overarching objective, not being forced to choose. I suppose my question for people on the panel is around the area I think that's going to be hard, which is on the technology side. So, if you look at the US semiconductor ban, the increasing bifurcation of technology, we're getting to the point where if you choose a technology, you are almost to some extent choosing sides. And I think that's going to be really challenging for the region.
I'll give it a go. Thanks, Melissa. I guess I don't have a great depth of knowledge on that particular question, but the one thing I do know is about the issue with cables and undersea cables, and I guess that's been dealt with in a number of different ways. But the view that countries like Australia and I guess New Zealand have on companies like Huawei has come from a body of information and evidence that has grown over a decade of the connection between that particular very successful company, which does provide very cheap and very effective infrastructure, and collection of intelligence by China, and therein lies the dilemma. So that there's been Pacific countries, and the one that particularly springs to mind is Papua New Guinea, that have seen the development advantage in that product, and then partners such as Australia have been particularly concerned about the security risk. But I mean, when we say security risk, to make it more specific, it's about intelligence and espionage that countries like Australia are concerned by. So that there becomes this tussle, and in terms of the major connections between the countries, that tends to have prevailed, that Huawei has been kept out of it, but within, say, the coastal cables for Papua New Guinea, Huawei provided it. And that's an interesting, there's two sides to the story, but from my own perspective, I'm quite convinced of the intelligence concern that is behind the way this is dealt with by countries like Australia.
I'll just add really quickly, thanks Melissa for your question. In the Common Development Vision, it outlined a host of proposed packages around cybersecurity, data systems, border, customs, and that raised an awful lot of concern about that. The position paper, which was released by Beijing within 24 to 48 hours afterwards, after the meeting with Foreign Minister Wang, omitted those aspects of the deal, and they were of significant concern to Pacific countries because of the degree of surveillance and other potential to it as well.
So, she's first.
Steve was first.
Do you think so?
Lily first.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, it's fine.
Start from the top.
Taylor, citizen of Papua New Guinea and the Blue Pacific. I just wanted to come back and start off with what Anna said about the pressure on confusing states to make a choice. And if you look back at the discussions that you've had today with regard to the China proposal that was put to the Pacific countries, I think I took a lot from what Prime Minister Fiame Mataafa said. And it was I interpreted it, and this is a personal interpretation, that it was rushed. That didn't say that there wasn't an alignment. I think there's a very strong alignment of what China's agenda is and what the Pacific agenda, particularly around development, infrastructure, and education. And I think nearly every Pacific state that has a relationship with China emphasizes that. Sometimes what I think happens with China in the Pacific is the manner of their discussions with us has always been a little bit much more contentious in the dialogue. And I think language poses a big problem. But for countries in the Pacific, in the way choices are made, I recall the former Prime Minister of Samoa giving me guidance when we were in Japan, when the Indo-Pacific strategy was first laid out, and subsequently when issues that arose during Nauru Forum, that these complications we have in our relationships with countries, we will sort out because our people have done so for generations. Just remember, this has all happened before too, of partners that have come into the region, stayed and then left, and then come back, then left and then come back. And I give credit to leadership in our countries that we will make those choices. But those choices will be the Pacific Island countries' choices, and it shouldn't be the choices that are being drummed up by a lot of other parties too. And I'll say it, parties to Indo-Pacific, parties to AUKUS, all this is now becoming a strategic venue for Western powers. And we're not talking about that. Nobody here is discussing what's the United States agenda in the Pacific. Where has it been for 40 years in the Southern and Southwest Pacific? What's been the history of what's happened to our Micronesian family? And all of us are looking at that. So it's not just China. I mean, you have a contentious arena because you've got two superpowers who are playing in there, and a lot of it is at the invitation of Australia asking for the US to be back here, or the US is seeing that the relationship with Pacific is not as strong as it used to be. I think that Sandra's comment also, a diversion now to the prioritization of issues and the climate issue. US military understand these issues because I've had conversations with them about the climate issue, but what are they going to do about it? These are policy decisions that have to be made by governments. But when you get to a COP meeting, the Pacific, half the time we're all talking to ourselves. And the developed world is talking to itself. So you've got an agreement now for a loss and damage. We had an agreement in Paris on that 100 billion, and what have we seen? Virtually nothing. And our nearest neighbours are still producing coal emissions. So the alignment, and when you get to the panel on architecture, I think this will be flushed out. But I think, we're creating just this dialogue around China, and I think there's a dialogue around the United States.
Sorry for taking up so long.
Well, thanks so much, Meg. In fact, I was just going to say the same thing. So I don't do that. Because the discussions yesterday and today, particularly in today's discussion, one of the things that's been missing has to do with the perhaps much bigger drones I view what's happening in the Pacific in terms of superpower, relative power contestation and so forth. The time when the situation of all islands was happening with China and the controversy around it, there were other things happening in the Pacific unfolding in ways which what Ben was talking about. China had come in with a piece of paper hoping that everybody will sign to it multilaterally. That was rejected. But the Pacific leaders were smart enough to say, hang on, we will look at exactly what we want to sign. And individually, bilaterally, they signed what was in the interest of their developmental goals and so forth. Different countries were doing that. And then the US were watching, hang on, I should be there doing that. And if you read the Pacific, the US Pacific Partnership Agreement, it's as if some of the technocrats have put together two documents. One is the Pacific Blue Continent 2050 and the Chinese document, and then did what I would say what a bad student would do in plagiarizing. They inserted themselves into the 2050 document in terms of funding, and they gave what promised $800 million divided by, say, 20 or whatever for 10 years. What do you get? Money enough just to buy a bag of peanut. No, so I suppose the issue has to do with the subtleties of the strategic contestation and the way in which, as Maggie said, at the global level, you don't see the big powers, the same people who are competing in the Pacific, coming and say, hang on, we will support you in this and that. No. But at the regional level, they become the, if you like, the ones defining the strategic dynamics within the region and forcing the Pacific countries to take sides. We saw the big imperial hegemony is better for them, the American version or the Chinese version. So when they went to Washington and they signed, or maybe the American version is better. But the Chinese are saying, I think we have won because we signed bilateral agreements with them. But the Americans say, no, we won because we signed the multilateral agreement. So the subtleties of those things is something that we have to be careful with. And of course, the Pacific states, as Meg said, have been dealing with these kinds of dynamics for a long time. And they know exactly, it's not because they've been bought off by the Americans. They're playing the game as well. Okay, you do it, we do it as well. At the end of the day, if you like, the political agency, the people, the leaders, those who sign, are doing that not because they selling off their soul. It's for their strategic interest, it's for their local constituency, and also for their, to serve their interests. So it's much more complex than simply this versus that, China versus the US. And we have to understand that the Pacific agency is also very significant in this particular situation.
I was glad that Karen von Strokius, University of New England, I was glad that climate change was raised as an issue in relation to China and its engagement, or lack thereof, on that topic in this region. But we could extend that to environmental issues more broadly, and particularly cause for concern is China's major role in deforestation and fisheries depletion in the region. And so that's something that perhaps a member of the panel could address. And in another area, Western regional partners such as Australia, the United States and so forth are very concerned about China's increasing security role in the region, but that's more for fear of the geopolitical implications and strategic implications for themselves. But from an islander point of view, I think what would be of more concern with increasing involvement in areas like policing is China's very poor record in human rights in China itself. And so perhaps a member of the panel would like to address that. Thank you.
Okay, should we respond? Yeah. Human rights. Anybody?
Okay, so I think probably the first thing in terms of the extractive question you had, I think before we, yes, there are issues around that, but we also need to remember the role of Australia and New Zealand and the United States, United Kingdom in phosphate mining, for instance, and Nauru and elsewhere, and the role that Australia, New Zealand and the United States and United Kingdom have played in depleting the region's resources. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
China's doing that.
No, but it's not a case of either or, but we just need to remember that there is still a lot of work that Australia, New Zealand and others need to do to rectify those wrongs as well. In terms of human rights, yeah, that's absolutely, that's certainly a concern. And that's something where, again, more work obviously needs to be done, but we also need to be mindful too of a temptation to not engage in addressing issues in the region, say in Solomon Islands or in Fiji around human rights issues, for fear of that could potentially create a vacuum into which China steps. And then we've certainly seen that, and certainly people throughout the region have raised their concerns that Australia and New Zealand haven't spoken up on human rights issues.
Yeah, I meant more from a domestic point of view rather than an Australian point of view.
So on the environmental issues, you look at the damage that the United States has done in the Micronesian region, the Marshall Islands. They have built a dome that's now starting to leak, and the environmental damage to that part of the country is very, very significant. France has done nuclear testing in French Polynesia. It's huge environmental damage. And a lot of work needs to be done to make sure that the country, the Pacific doesn't get contaminated to the extent it threatens their life. Marshall Islands, a lot of them are still recovering from the deformities that their parents have experienced from the past. So we have to balance the environmental issues with what other powers have done in the region and going to go forward. There's a lot of lots of ordinances that are around in Micronesia from the wars. Those need to be cleaned up. They're threatening human security threat to Pacific Islands from Solomon Islands all the way to Palau. And one of the islands in Palau is just contaminated with ordinances. It needs to be cleaned. And so it's outstanding environmental work from traditional partners from the past, including Japan. So, we've got to balance these environmental issues with what has been done from the past. And I still think there's a lot of work to be done from all the nuclear testing that's been going on, and all the ordinances that are still left around the Pacific threatening human security.
Last questions from gentlemen over there.
Tom Worthington from the School of Computing here at the ANU. What is the role of social media and our conventional media in the region in highlighting these issues and perhaps in cases amplifying the tensions involved? And are there initiatives we can have to help with this situation?
Hey, Joe, do you have any response?
I don't have any answers for the question, except to say that the media and they're quite active in terms of covering some of these issues. And recently they had a conference in Honiara for the media.
There's issues around disinformation and misinformation. I think the classic example you can look at for is the Indonesian attempt around providing disinformation around the West Papua issue. and they deliberately go onto websites and make sure that they misinform. Sorry, so that's what I can think about in terms of the misinformation that's prevalent in this part of the region, particularly Indonesia's role or Indonesian misinformation around West Papuan issue.
I was wondering if I could respond to something Dame Taylor said earlier, because we didn't really answer Dame's points, and I'm just selecting one of your comments, which was that you felt there was an alignment between Pacific Island countries and China in terms of development, infrastructure and education. And that's been pretty clear for a very long time. I agree with you. What I would say is that the Belt and Road Initiative and the bilateral initiatives that existed for a long time leading up to this year have been the vehicle for providing that, as China has organised its ability to do that and to mobilise its resources in the region. And that what we saw this year with this new proposal, which was multilateral, it went beyond the economic, it went beyond the development initiatives that are clearly needed by the Pacific Islands and which China is in a position to provide, and connected them with political and security issues and made them multilateral. I think that's probably one of the big differences with the Common Development Vision proposal from earlier this year and what was happening beforehand. But the Belt and Road Initiative and the way that China was engaging the region was very much economically led. What we saw this year was a change to that. So I wonder whether that's something that the Pacific aligns with, is the change, because I get the impression that most countries want to engage economically, but not necessarily politically and in terms of security.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, okay.
I'm a diplomat because I've been listening to a lot of academics this morning and respective representatives of the universities here. There have been some very good interventions, and especially presentations by comments by the panel. And Henry made a comment that struck me about how do the Pacific people view Chinese presence and engagements, the ordinary citizens, that is. As far as we're concerned, it's basically looking at our survival, every day. We don't think highly about the interventions going on at a very high level of engagement in the Pacific of our respective development partners and China. But on the other hand, there's also another very interesting comment that was made, that perhaps we are so comfortable with each other in the openness of discourse amongst our development partners and our Pacific partners, that when it comes to Chinese, they do remain an enigma, and possibly why that there's never a very closer discourse as we have with you. But at the same time, I come back to my comments that I made earlier about the concept of Pacific family. And I did mention yesterday the values of the principles on which a Pacific family is based: trust and respect. And I hear references to the AUKUS agreements, to all the other declarations that have been made, where we've only been told after the event has been discussed and agreed to. Even in my role here, as I said before, the Honorable Prime Minister of Japan visited Australia most recently. And high commissioners were called in for a briefing. It was practically 10 minutes, where the Japanese officials and the Australian officials told us of this visit and that there was going to be a declaration that was going to be signed on security. And the comment was made that this premise was premised on a vision for the Pacific. And I raised the question, what is the vision? Because to me, it comes back again, you know, you give so much, you say so much, and then you fall short of treating us respectively and truthfully as members of the Pacific. If that vision is basically your security, then what does it say for us? Because we keep coming back to Indo-Pacific, separate from Pacific family. If you are genuinely interested in bringing us along as members of your family, and I spoke yesterday about when you enter a Pacific family, it's for life. It's not just brother, it's beyond that. You saw the most recent Rugby Cup, World Cup, Rugby League Cup, and the cry of the Samoans was, Uso for it. It's brothers in adversity, but friends for life. And we take that very seriously in the concept of family. But it's also to do with the fact that, we're not saying we're not appreciative of what you're doing for us. You are our development partners because basically we are small island nations. With the exception of Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji, who have got a lot of natural resources, a lot of us are small open economies, basically agriculture and fisheries. And so when we look at you as development partners, and we look at you and we start talking family, we appreciate that. But when it comes to matters of security, we have the focused notion what that is for you as to whether it means for us. And we know that we don't have any military presence in our respective countries except for Tonga, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. All of us, we have small police forces. And I must commend the comments made by the gentleman who was talking about his police experience in the Pacific. Because the Australian Federal Police have done a magnificent job in terms of the law enforcement programs that they have been running in the Pacific. And that has been very, very useful and actually a tool in terms of looking at our legislations, our regulations, and training. But that's about it because a lot of us goes back to non-traditional means. And it's sort of that. A lot of our Pacific members know the issue of consensus building, principle of consensus building towards creating pathways to peace. That is basically an approach that most of the Pacific take. And so when I listen in tonight or today about this, conversation going on about China, unless you tell us what is there for you to be so concerned about, but you're not sharing fully with us, because you talk about your intelligence, it's restricted. Why? Because, it's just the way things are. And so if you want us to be engaged fully and to provide that support you're looking for, we don't want it to be a numbers game. We want it to be genuinely something built on those principles of trust and respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a lot of discussion. I don't think we can finish within 1.5 hours. So we can continue our discussion in the morning tea, I guess, extended to it. So thank you very much for great speakers and a great audience. So thank you very much.